This session is on Frantz Fanon, and Decolonisation and Revolution is a part of our Black Thinkers Matters course, and Ken Olende is going to start. He's one of the authors of Say It Loud and is on the ISJ board. Do you want to start?
Right. Firstly, is this mic working, Ken? No.
You just use this one.
Is this mic working? Good. Right. Talking about Frantz Fanon, who's one of the great heroes of the anti-colonial movement, and someone who comes in and out of fashion. And he's one of those thinkers that whenever he comes into fashion, he seems to be a different person sometimes. People look at different aspects of him, and I think it's interesting to look at, I suppose, why it is that there are so many different facets to Fanon that come up. And one of them is, in a relatively short political career, he was involved in an awful lot of changing things and dramatic bits of history. And I want to start by when he came back in fashion for the latest time. Now, after we've got a new movement that's sprung up around Black Lives Matter, around the movement against racism, the racist police in America. One of the slogans, which I think is interesting, of that movement is "We Can't Breathe," which comes from Eric Garner, who was one of the people who was choked by a policeman, and his dying words were "I can't breathe." As he repeated that, the police went on choking him. But the phrase "we can't breathe" is something which echoes something Fanon said, and it's something that talks to revolt and the rage of the oppressed, which I think is where Fanon's ideas keep coming back. I'll talk about his various books, but one of his two probably most famous books, Black Skin, White Masks, he wrote, "It is not because the Indo-Chinese discovered a culture of their own that they revolted. Quite simply, it was because it became impossible for them to breathe in more than one sense of the word." That under colonial oppression, it becomes impossible to breathe. You need to revolt. And I suppose what Fanon tends to talk about is the fact that revolt becomes something which has to be done. And this is one of the reasons why he remains popular and remains someone who is looked at again and again by people who are fighting oppression. Now, I want to go back. He's very much associated with the Battle of Algiers, with the fight for Algerian independence. But he wasn't from Algiers. He was actually from a French colony in the Caribbean, a small island called Martinique. This is the Caribbean. I have circled Martinique in red. It's one of the smaller islands. It's over there on the far side. Not well known particularly, but one of the things to look at in the Caribbean, and I think this will affect Fanon and how his ideas developed, is why Caribbean islands were part of the French Empire. That in fact the Caribbean had become a place it was one of the first areas of European colonisation. It was a place that was fought over a number of centuries between the Portuguese, the Spanish, and later the French and the British empires. One of the key places in the Caribbean is the island that's now known as Haiti, that was Saint-Domingue, which was at one point the richest part of the French Empire. And why was this? Where did this wealth come from? This wealth came out of slavery. It came out of the transporting of millions of black people from Africa across to the Caribbean, where they were treated as less than human, and many people died. One of the things that there is also a tradition of across the Caribbean is resistance. It was in the Caribbean that in Saint-Domingue you saw the rebellion led by Toussaint Louverture, which overthrew slavery and led to the first independent black republic in this area. And one of Louverture's points was a pride in being black and in being as good as the people who had previously owned them as slaves. In fact, he wrote a letter in 1792 saying, "Yes, gentlemen, we are free like you, and it is only by your avarice and our ignorance that anyone is still held in slavery up to this day, and we can neither see nor find the right that you pretend to have over us." So there was a real feeling of pride in resistance, and you see this coming up again and again in various forms of resistance. However, it's also interesting that you see a really deep, entrenched racism that develops alongside slavery. In fact, I would argue, it's not really the subject of this meeting, that racism in its modern form develops really in this area around slavery by trying to justify why Africans are treated in such an appalling way. But the experience that develops is an idea of a multitude of different racial types. This is a picture known as a casta painting. This one's from Mexico, but through a lot of the different colonial empires, less so in the English-speaking ones, but you had ideas of a hierarchy of races. When people sometimes talk about mulattoes and different terms like this now, it seems like just another term for sort of black or perhaps mixed. But actually, these paintings, and I'm not going to go through them, go through all sorts of different bits. You're this much, you're an eighth black, you're mostly white, you've got some Native American blood in, and all these sorts of things. And there was a complicated hierarchy based on this. Why is this important for Fanon? Fanon grew up in Martinique as part of the middle class, and he was someone who regarded himself, he was light-skinned, as someone who was, well, pretty much French was the way he looked at it. And he describes in his book, I'm going to talk mostly about two books. One is this one, Black Skin, White Masks, which was his first major book, and the other will be The Wretched of the Earth, which is his most famous work. But he did wrote some autobiographical bits in Black Skin, White Masks, and he talks about growing up as a child in Martinique. He says, "I'm a Negro, but of course I do not know it, simply because I am one. When I'm at home, my mother sings me French love songs in which there is no word about Negroes." I should say, in terms of the language, he was writing in the 1950s, and Negro was the polite word for black people at that time. "When I disobey, I make too much noise. I'm told to stop acting like a nigger." Nigger was the offensive word for black people at that time still. So there's this feeling that in his family, you could be polite and French, or you could end up, if you were black, that was a horrible thing to be. And this is how he was brought up, seeing himself as French, and as a middle-class person, seeing himself as someone who hoped to aspire to be a full citizen of France and to go and get educated in France. Indeed, when the Second World War broke out, I should say, Fanon was born in 1925. In terms of placing him in history, that's the same year that Malcolm X was born. So he was someone who had that experience of that period of history. When the Second World War broke out, he admired French values and what he'd been taught in the school about being French, and he volunteered to fight for the French army. Now, this is the Free French Army, which fought against Germany, and it's interesting, for people who are interested in military uniforms, they were supplied with military uniforms by the Americans because they were pushed back. And a lot of people don't realise this day that many of the French troops were fighting were actually from the African colonies. They also had volunteers, people like Fanon, who went because he had an idea of what French democracy was. That when as a young man living in Martinique, he might be abused as a black person, he would assume that that was a thing that the colonists did, not something that happened in France, where you read about all the great history of revolution and liberation and so on. He was very shocked when he volunteered and fought with the French army at the racism he faced. And as he came into Europe, the greater and greater degrees of racism that he faced, and the degree, it's interesting, again, it's subject for another meeting, the degree to which, as the French army started advancing across France, de Gaulle, the leader, desperately looked around for white troops because he didn't want Paris to be liberated by black troops. So there was something real going on here, and it started getting Fanon to think about what is this feeling that he had, his pride in being French, his rejection of being black, much as he realised as time was going on more and more that he saw himself as a black person. And in this situation, he stayed in France. He started, after the war, started studying medicine and went on to study as a psychiatrist. And one of the things that his first book, which I've already mentioned, this is the first edition of it, is called in English Black Skin, White Masks. And he's starting to talk now about this feeling of being a colonised person. What does it mean to be someone who is part of a colonial empire? What kind of attitude does it give you when you're looking at the colonizer? And he says a lot in this book, but one of the things he says is every colonized people, in other words, every people in whose soul an inferiority complex has been created by the death and burial of its local cultural originality, finds itself face to face with the language of the civilizing nation, that is the culture of the mother country. So you have this strange relationship where you lose pride in yourself and your own background and start being jealous of or wanting to feel like the person who is colonizing you. So it's a strangely abusive relationship, I would say. And this is what comes in the title. This is a modern painting which is trying to get the idea of what it feels like to be colonised. The white mask is the black colonised person who tries to see themselves through the coloniser. So they start seeing themselves as if they were white, which leads to a form of self-hatred. And this was not a new idea with Fanon. I wanted to quote an earlier black theoretician, the American writer W.E.B. Du Bois, who had said something similar when he was talking about the double consciousness. And he said, it is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body, whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. Now, that was in the Souls of Black Folks in 1903. But Fanon takes these ideas and develops them through as a psychiatrist, and starts looking at what it means, how it affects people who are being torn asunder in this way. And he's become very much, as probably becoming obvious from the quotations, hostile to imperialism and particularly colonialism. Because the period that we're talking about is a period of mass anti-colonialism. If you think about the period between the wars, the earlier period, it was a period of the great empires. This is when the British Empire had the sun never setting on it. This was when the French Empire had lots of bits of the world that the British hadn't got. And they thought that this was going to go on. At the end of the Second World War, the Great War for Democracy, England had lost India, but it thought we can hold on to pretty much the rest of the empire. What you saw after this was a period when the colonised peoples started saying we're not going to have this, and you saw a mass resistance around the world. In terms of the experience that Fanon saw, there are two particularly significant struggles which he watches and writes about. The first one is the struggle in Vietnam. Now, when we talk about the Vietnam War, people tend to think about the war with the Americans in the 60s. Actually, before that, Vietnam had been a French colony, and the first war was a war to get rid of the French. This finished with the battle at Dien Bien Phu in 1954, when the French were decisively defeated. This is a photo of the French headquarters with the Viet Minh flag flying on top of it. I'm not even going to start going into how it was that the Americans ended up there later on. But at the moment, this showed that concerted resistance by a colonial people could push out the colonizer, and it was something which looked like something of a model to Fanon. You can see, because I'm going to come on to things that he didn't look to as models later on. Another war that he looked to particularly, and it's one I want to come back to in a minute, was an anti-colonial war against the British. These are fighters in the Kenya Land Freedom Army, who are better known as the Mau Mau, who fought against the British in Kenya in the mid-50s. Now, while this rebellion was defeated, it nonetheless got to a situation where the British thought, we don't want to militarily risk this kind of thing happening again. It was too expensive and cost too many lives. It cost a hell of a lot of African lives, but they were more worried about British lives at that time. So, as Fanon is coming round, he starts thinking about psychological explanations of what's going on, why there is colonialism and how colonial ideas work. He's also looking at anti-colonial resistance movements. Now, there's a lot to be said about what he said in his first book, Black Skin, White Masks. Leo Zelig, who's written, I would recommend for people who want to know an awful lot more about Fanon than I've got time to say, Leo Zelig's book on Frantz Fanon, which is available from Bookmarks, The Militant Philosopher of Third World Revolution, who talks about the various books he wrote and his arguments. But he says one thing about how his ideas develop. Fanon develops a distinct, powerful style in Black Skin, White Masks, full of poetry and rhythm. His prose demands to be read aloud. He seeks to tell a story about race relations as a prose poet. He does not analyse distant sociological categories, but tries to invoke in the reader an experience of what race and racism really mean and how they are felt. I thought it was worth reading that out, because I think if you haven't read Fanon and you start reading his books, that is the experience you get. And it's an interesting thing if you're a writer or think about writing. Fanon never learnt to type and never wrote all that much. What he tended to do was dictate his books. So he would talk usually to his wife, but this is something, and she would type up the books. So the feeling of his books as a speech is something that's very much there in the way they were written. And I think that this is something which that comes through out of the books. I should incidentally say, in terms of the, as I said, different versions of Fanon who come in and out of fashion, that sometimes he's presented as a black man who hated white people and was calling for the death of all white people. This is very much not the case. He did, as I'll come back to, say that it was necessary to use violence to kill colonizers, but he didn't say that that meant that black people should hate white people. I'm mentioning this at this point because his wife, Josie, was a working class French white woman, and he didn't see that as a problem in his life or his understanding of what was going on in terms of race relations. He certainly didn't see it as being part of any having any lack of pride in being black or in defending the rights of colonized people. So when he talks about the black skin, the white masks, he's not talking about a fixed essentialist sort of idea that this is the relationship between black and white people and it's something that doesn't change. He's talking about a specific thing that comes out of the relation between a colonized people and a people who are colonizing them. And you could use this in a wider sense. I think that when people talk about this in terms of, for instance, experience of racism in America or something, it's, I should say racism in Britain as well, but it's usually racism in America that gets talked about. It's not ridiculous to make the comparison, but it is, again, it's something that shifts. It's something that he's saying this can change. It's not a fixed position. So Fanon's ideas are changing very quickly. So he first became really politically active during the Second World War. As he's come and is living in France in the period after the Second World War, he's becoming more and more interested in politics and interested in the kinds of ideas that are going on. This means he's engaging with all sorts of people. Most of the ideas that are coming up, most of the anti-colonial groups see themselves as leftist, often as Marxist, and he's engaging with these ideas. Now, we'll try and come back, if there's time, to say a bit about why he didn't regard himself as a Marxist. Though if you read his works, he often quotes Marx sympathetically and has quite a lot of respect for the kinds of ideas that, that Marx came up with. But I'm going to move on. He wanted a job. He's qualified as a psychiatrist. He's something of a go-getter. He wrote this book, Black Skin, White Mask. He was hoping to use it as his thesis. They wouldn't allow that in the end. But so he published a book, radical book that challenged this establishment at a young age, and then he's looking for a post. He's not offered one in France. He's offered one in Algeria. Now, which he accepts. He's got no particular interest in Algeria at this point, but he goes there. This is him he's on the, sorry to use the word, far right in this picture, but he's here, he's arrived in Algeria, where he is working as a psychiatrist. Now, what's happened in Algeria at this point says something about this whole background I've been talking about the colonial empires and things that are going on. During the Second World War, France was either kicked out of various bits of its empire or used them as bases for pushing back. Its North African empire was particularly key to this, and a lot of the French government was based in North Africa for sections of the war. At the end of the war, there was all talk of what a wonderful age this is. It's going to be an age of national independence and freedom and everyone having their rights. So you started seeing in Algeria a mass movement of people saying, we'll have some of that. We want some of this freedom, some of this national independence. France had conquered Algeria. In case people don't know, there should be a map. This is North Africa, Algeria being the big country over there on the left. Notice just next to it on the right, Tunisia, which will come into the story later on. France had conquered Algeria in the 1830s. As with most of what was going on through the 19th century in terms of European expansion, it was by brutal military conquest. The French said that they were leading a civilizing mission, that what was happening was we were taking this barbaric backward country and giving it the benefits of French civilization. If you actually look at literacy figures, for instance, they collapse after the French invasion, but nonetheless, it becomes part of the empire. One thing that's quite different about the way the French ran their empire from the way the British ran them, they're both fairly brutal, and I don't want to say all that much about differences, but the French tend to say, and they did particularly with Algeria, that this is now part of France. We're now adding it on to France. It's another section of France, and everyone who lives here is a French citizen, and you should be grateful of being part of France. This, in fact, was sheer nonsense. The settlers who were French settlers who were known as Pieds Noirs, they were treated as French citizens and had various advantages. The ordinary Arabs were not treated as French citizens. They were treated as dirt with enormous degrees of racism. These are the people who, at the end of the Second World War, start saying we want democracy, we want education, we want rights. The Pieds Noirs respond in a place called Sétif with a massacre. There's a protest demanding independence. The number of people who were killed there has never been formalised, but it was at least, I think 6,000 is the figure that's most commonly given. And you just think that this is before you have the rebellion starting. This is people celebrating democracy at the end of the Second World War, demanding their right to some of the things which the French government and the British government, all these governments are saying, this is what we fought for. And the response is this, the shot down, gunned down on the streets. The French left come out of the events that are going to follow up very badly, for which reasons I will hope to talk to. But Jean-Paul Sartre will write the introduction to The Wretched of the Earth, which talks about people's resistance, that the wretched of the earth are the poor peasants, the people who fight back, and they're the people who the future belongs to. Sartre talks about the boomerang effect, and what he's saying is people will talk in the Algerian War or any other resistance war about the terrible violence of the rebels, and they'll say, look, how can you talk and negotiate with these people? They're savage. He says that this is like a boomerang. They've forgotten, or perhaps they never learned about this. They never learnt about the violence that happened first from the colonial state, that the rebels are responding to, that kind of violence. And that's something which comes on throughout the anti-colonial revolutions. So I'm going to have to cut this very short because there isn't really time to do a meeting on the Algerian Revolution at the same time as talking about Fanon and so on. But we'll say that this is a period I would incidentally recommend people to see the Battle of Algiers if you haven't, which is a film which goes through a lot of what happens. But to cut a very long story short, some of which, incidentally, you can read in various books that Fanon wrote. I should say I'm talking about 2 books, but he wrote a number of other books as well. I'm just having to cut down for series for reasons of time. An organisation was set up called the FLN, the National Front for the Liberation of the country. It had an armed wing called the ALN. And this started a guerrilla war against the French. Now, through the 50s, the tactics that were used in this war changed. Sometimes it was based on fighting in the rural areas and trying to get areas where the French couldn't operate. Sometimes it meant coming into Algiers and leading an urban guerrilla organisation. Occasionally it meant leading to strikes and working with unions and so on. But mostly it was an armed insurrection. In the countryside, there were arguments among the leadership about exactly how it was that you should take on the French, but it was a national liberation movement, and what it was calling for was the end of the colonial occupation. One of the things that you see an argument about going through is what should happen afterwards. Should you discuss, do we want socialism? Do we want some kind of redistribution of the wealth? Because a lot of the time, the leadership was saying, let's not talk about that. This is the stage where we just get rid of the French. And I think that that's problematic because it does mean that you don't know exactly what will happen when you get to the end of the war. As I said, this is just another thing. This is actually in Algiers, the kind of street demonstrations and the kind of fighting that people were facing. But let's go back to Fanon. Fanon has arrived as a psychiatrist. He's working in a hospital, and he starts treating people, often French soldiers, who are involved in torturing Algerian revolutionaries. And he finds himself dealing with the shattered minds of the torturers. He also finds he's dealing with people who've been tortured, not surprisingly, perhaps because of his background, because of what he's been doing, he finds a way, as a foreigner, to join the FLN. And we get to a stage where he is working in the hospital. In the daytime, he is treating French soldiers and Pieds Noirs who've been involved in the suppression of the rebellion. By night, he is meeting guerrillas who've been involved in fighting back. And it's very interesting to read some of the things. He talks about the cases. And when he talks later on about the necessity of violence, about how important it is to use violence to push back and free yourself from this black skin, white mask, the idea that you are underneath and inferior to the colonialist, I think he exaggerates the degree to which it's liberating to use violence against someone. But nonetheless, He's not doing it from a distant ivory tower sort of way. He's doing it as someone who treated the victims on both sides of this. He seriously tried to treat the French torturers to stop them from the suffering that they were having. But he also talks, there's one of the examples he gives is of two Arab boys who got a boy settler and stabbed him to death because they wanted to be part of the resistance, but then after that they were totally traumatized by what they'd done and came to him as a psychiatrist. So that there's this whole feeling of that violence doesn't in itself solve the situation. Because I'm running out of time, I should quickly say for a while he leads this double life. Eventually he gets a warning that the authorities are closing in on him, and he flees. He leaves the country, eventually will become based in Tunis and Tunisia, becomes now an outspoken spokesperson for the FLN, and starts talking about the need for risings, not just in Africa, in Algeria, but across the colonial world, and he starts travelling around, going to different places. I'm not going to go through all the places he goes to. He discovers, and this is why this meteoric rise, he suddenly discovers he's got leukemia, and he's about to die. I mean, this is the thing. At the time, the only hope he's got of survival is to go to America, and for a long time he doesn't want to go to America because they're the worst imperialist power, and it seems like a betrayal to go there. Eventually he does, but it's not enough. So what he does is decides to write everything he's got left in one book. So he dictates this book, which becomes The Wretched of the Earth, and writes it, and it's published as he dies. I mean, not the day he dies, but, you know, it's published as his dying commemoration. And it is full of the rage and anger at colonialism, which is what his work is full of. Now, I do want to briefly say a couple of things about it, because it's not political treatise. It is more of a rant of rage, which is one of the reasons why it's so popular to this day. But he does talk about various groups of people. He talks about the hypocrisy of the Europeans who demand reparations from Germany for what it did to Europe. And he says, not long ago, Nazism transformed the whole of Europe into a veritable colony. The governments of the various European nations called for reparations and demanded the restitution in kind of money and wealth which had been stolen, and so on. He says, well, where are our reparations? Where are the reparations for all the colonised countries who've had their economies destroyed by what's going on? And this is something which continues through his life, and this is one of the reasons why he becomes a hero to other to later anti-colonialists. But he looks very much at what's going on and decides that there are certain areas where who you should rely on. And one of the things he says is, if you look at colonial movements, anti-colonial movements, you've got to rely on the peasantry and the lumpenproletariat, that is the people who are pushed off the land, often come and live in shantytowns around cities, not the working class, because the working class is bought off. In fact, they're people who are unreliable. They've got most benefit from the colonialists arriving, and therefore the people you can always rely on to fight will be the lumpenproletariat and the poor peasants, and don't rely on the embourgeoisified, the people who've got benefits from the existing class. Now, I think he's wrong here on a couple of reasons. One is that he runs in together all the people who are living in the cities, whether they're the people who have actually become middle class and have a certain benefit from the system, or the workers. And why this matters is interesting. I'm just going to skip back to Kenya for a bit. Now, he wouldn't have known that much about the Mau Mau War. He would have known that the British came in, arrested lots of people, and there was a peasant war in the countryside. What he probably didn't know was that the organisation which came up, which led the resistance against the British, came out of a trade union movement. The best organised people were trade unionists. He does say at one point that nationalist leaders never support movements. He should say that this is the leaders of Kenya. Jomo Kenyatta, who went on to become president, is in the middle, but at the sides you have Fred Kubai and Bildad Kagia, who were the leaders of the urban Mau Mau. They both came out of trade union movements and were people who went on to use that to start organising in the cities. I would love to talk more about that because it's one of the areas that I'm really interested in, but I'm not going to. I'm going to say it was after these people were arrested in an early crackdown that things moved into the countryside and it became a war in the countryside, and actually it was less effective as a war against the British. And the idea that having less organised people and people with less of a something that cohered them together was better for fighting against colonialism was, I think, a major error and one which has led to problems later on. I think it led to problems to some extent in Algeria, but the idea that it's the least organised people are the people who are your friends is a problem. And he himself looked forward to what was happening and said you've got to be careful about the leadership that you give to these people like the lumpen proletariat, because they can end up siding with the other side, which I think is something, it's a pity he didn't have a chance to look into further. But the other reason, this is really drawing things to a close, is why he was suspicious of the left and so on was because of the behaviour of the French left, and particularly the main force of the French left, which was the Communist Party during the Algerian War, which did not support the FLN, did not support the call for independence. It did call for, and the Socialist Party, which is the equivalent of the Labour Party, was actually one of the people who was carrying out a lot of the war. The Communist Party called for an end to the war, but it called for it on a, frankly, basically, for instance, there was a draft, a call-up of conscription for people. The Communist Party said, go along, and when you're posted in Algeria, you'll be able to talk to the local Arabs and get them so that we can get over the war. The idea that the people who were posted there as colonial occupiers were going to be the people who sorted things out said a lot about the problems with the Communist Party. Now, there were demonstrations just calling for peace, calling for an end to things, but the politics of the Communist Party were very weak. I've got to stop now, but I hope what I've shown is that his politics, Fanon's politics, changed very quickly over a relatively short period of time. And it's tragic to me, that, as with so many of these leaders, whether it's Malcolm X or others like it, he died so young, his ideas were still developing. The book that he's remembered for was something which was written, it's well worth reading, but it was written in a rush as he knew he was dying, and therefore that I would like to see how things would have advanced later on. He did talk about the importance of violence and not negotiating. Of course, actually, in order to get independence, which Algiers did eventually, they did have to negotiate. He also talked about the dangers of what will happen after independence, which I can't talk about now. Perhaps people will bring it up in the discussion. But he became something of an icon to resistance movements since then. I think that he's someone we should remember, and there's an awful lot that Fanon wrote that is worth remembering, but we have to do it by looking at it in the context of why he said what he said at the time he was saying it, and look at how those ideas apply now, rather than deifying him or making him someone who is in some way beyond criticism. So thanks, I'll leave it there.
So if you have a contribution or question, please raise your hand.
Oh, thank you very much. My name's Tara Van Dyke. I'm not English, as you can tell, but American. I'll admit it. Thank you very much. I guess I have two comments or maybe a question to get your response on in terms of thinking of bringing this forward now to contemporary relevance. And I spent quite a bit of time, well, with the poor working class in my own country, but also in India and China. What I find is that we could make the argument that there's proletarian faces and bourgeois masks. There seems to be an acceptance about the future, and it's about acceptance of that there's a backwardness, there's a lack in terms of how they can also achieve or be empowered to achieve a kind of consumer, quote-unquote, modern lifestyle. And I wonder if there's any homology there. And on the second, violence, I think we should try to look at ourselves. We're trying to be beautiful souls too much when we condemn violence. I can totally get on board that as an offense, violence is, I'm never for that. But on our competitors or our adversaries usually have no qualms about that. So if we keep on putting all these check boxes that we have to check before we actually do anything constitutive, I wonder if that's an issue. And I'll use two examples. I think that if I'm right, Gandhi, the first thing was, you should come and not react violently to violence, but there's going to be violence. But what was worse, if I'm right, is that not doing anything at all. So he was much more against the coward than people who said, look, we'll come out and fight, but I cannot promise to not fight back. And in terms of Palestine and Israel, I lived in Palestine for 2 years, and I'm very thankful to Norm Finkelstein, who disabused me of the need to always think I had to condemn Palestinian violence before I got into the politics and the ethics of that conflict. And I would say that when we do that, we create a false equivalence between the defensive, largely symbolic violence of the Palestinians fighting for survival and the war crimes that are going on by the Israeli government. So I don't have the answer, but I think that we have to really engage more on this issue of violence. And when can we know when and how and if and how to respond to different varieties of it? Thank you.
Thank you. I would just like to ask a question regarding his knowledge of Marxism. And you were going to go on later on and say why he wasn't a Marxist. I'd like a few clarifications on that one.
Hello, yes, taking up the bit that you mentioned, Fanon talked about the end of the Algerian War. I'm in the middle of rereading a really good book called by Hamou Amirouche, Memoirs of a Mujahideen, which is the only book, I think, written by somebody who fought in the Algerian War of Independence and went on to become an academic. And Bookmarks hasn't unfortunately got it yet, but hopefully they will. And the war, the countryside war, you mentioned Battle of Algiers, but obviously most of the warfare did take place in the countryside, and he focuses on the war in Kabylia. And by the way, you know, they wouldn't all call themselves Arabs; they would also call themselves Berbers or Amazigh. They talked about being a fish swimming in the water. I think this might have come from somewhere else. And the French had the idea that to stop the fish, you had to get rid of the water. In other words, the ordinary people, and they moved thousands and thousands of them to concentration camps, in effect. They used torture, they used napalm, they used bombings, they used psychological warfare to a terrifying extent, a plot called the Blade plot, which actually ended up, and Hamou Amirouche writes about this in a very hard-to-read chapter, how really that led to the FLN and ALN torturing and killing their own comrades, who they'd been falsely led to believe were traitors. So there's quite a lot in it that, following on, I know talked about the psychological effect of torture. And I think also the question you said he mentioned about the problem at the end of the war, there's bitterness to this day, I think, that the Armée des Frontières, the people who were outside Algeria, who failed to get the arms and weapons in that were needed, other people who marched in and took over in what should have been a glorious liberation, was actually the beginning of a dictatorship that took place from 1962 up to this day. And today you see the magnificent weekly, in fact today is the Algerian independence commemoration today, the July the 5th, and there should be massive demonstrations up and down the country in Algeria, demanding what they fought for in the Algerian War of Independence, which they never have had. So, you know, look at your news reports today. You should see massive demonstrations there, and also there'll be one in London tomorrow afternoon at the Algerian embassy. So I wish he'd also been around to write for a little bit more, to analyse what actually happened as a result. Thank you.
Am I the right person to be speaking, or shall I carry on? Yeah. I just wanted your authorization first. I think thanks, Ken, for a great introduction. I think it's important to emphasize that even if Fanon wasn't a Marxist, he's a great revolutionary, and we have to see him as part of the revolutionary tradition that we want to build on now in the 21st century. On the question of violence, I think that the points that were made at the front are very well taken. I mean, the Algerian War took 1 million lives. 1 million people were killed in the Algerian War, and crucial to that was the extremely brutal violence waged by the French state. I mean, one thing I wonder about in Fanon's preoccupation with violence is that both Algeria and Kenya, which are the places of the two great African liberation struggles of the 1950s, were settler colonies. So you didn't just have the colonial state oppressing people, but you also had the colons, the settlers, farmers and relatively privileged workers and so on, spread throughout the society, and maybe that introduced a dimension of bitterness to the struggle that mightn't have been so strong in other contexts. The other one, someone raised the question about the kind of Marxism that was available to Fanon at the time, and I think that's an important point, because on the one hand you have not just the French Communist Party complicit in colonialism, but also them practicing a completely sterile Marxism. I mean, there were others. I mean, a group of French Trotskyists actually devoted a lot of their time to smuggling arms to the FLN, so there's another side to the picture. But also you have Sartre, who doesn't just write the preface to The Wretched of the Earth, but who himself sought to rethink Marxism in his critique of dialectical reason in a way that was quite close to Fanon's approach, because they're both Fanon and Sartre are preoccupied with the if you like, the development of revolutionary consciousness and the other side of that, different kinds of oppression, and they're both are very fertile, but it's quite a subjectivist form of Marxism. So I think we can say Fanon is a great revolutionary, but he's very much shaped by the conditions in which he was operating. Doesn't diminish his greatness, but he reflects his circumstances.
I just have one question in my head. I mean, to what extent is violence necessary this side of the revolution? Obviously, the working class must be at the center of things, strikes and so on and so forth. But if they get attacked by, say, tanks or something, how are they supposed to defend their factories or whatever without using violence?
One of the things that was done by French Trotskyists and also some British people was some British engineers did actually go to Morocco and teach Algerians how to make bombs and guns and so forth. And the other thing that was done was the forging of French money and French papers so that insurgents in France could travel freely under false identities to support the Algerians. And to be honest, organisations that don't have schools for forgery seem to me to be not looking at the future very carefully. And I think that you really do have to do that sort of thing. But if people want to read, there's an excellent edition, edited by a former member of the Socialist Workers' Party, of revolutionary history on the Algerian War. And it recounts the domestic struggle inside France, which was, and the war as well, but particularly with regard to inside France. Absolutely fascinating. And a last point about violence. Look at the Russian Revolution. What did the Red Army start as? self-defense units of workers' militia. And they only went over to the offensive when they were counterattacked. Now, the one thing they did do very early on was to shoot their officers.
What's the name of the collection? Revolutionary history. I forget the number.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. In South Africa, Frantz Fanon has enjoyed a resurrection, and that is around the economic freedom fighters, who are a militant young group, and they've included him in their manifesto. They argue that the ANC, for argument's sake, is the first stage of liberation, middle-class people coming to power and actually compromising to the existing old racists is what Fanon critiques. So the EFF take up that same critique to be able to challenge the ANC. In other words, they've lost their way, they've compromised with the old white racists or monopoly capitalism, and it's very popular. So in their manifesto they say they've closed the ring of revolution. That's a debate whether they're Marxist-Leninists, Fanonists. So.
Excuse me. I just want to pick up on the title of this course, Black Thinkers Matter, and actually the specific title of this session, Frantz Fanon, Decolonisation and Revolution, because obviously, clearly they were chosen for a specific reason. And if you think of Black Thinkers Matter, is clearly a kind of riff on Black Lives Matter. And I just really wanted to pick up on that a little bit, because one of the other great black thinkers, black Marxists, C.L.R. James, talked about how there's this concept of the docile Negro, that black people never appear in the histories, that black struggles, the militancy of black struggles, anti-colonial struggles, anti-slavery struggles, never appears in the pages of capitalist historians. And the importance of thinkers like Fanon and Walter Rodney and C.L.R. James himself is that they highlight that fantastic, militant, angry history, and that's the importance of a course like this. And of course, one of the great things that we've seen over the last few years, and I certainly recommend Rayhad Desai's film that will be showing later, Everything Must Fall, is the struggle to decolonise curriculums and to force a recognition and a discussion and a debate about people like Fanon and Walter Rodney and black thinkers onto the agenda. And as Alex said, they may not necessarily, in all of the cases, have been explicitly Marxist, but they are certainly part of a revolutionary tradition, a tradition of arguing for struggle from below. One last point I wanted to make, just picking up on where Ken started and the idea of the colonial mindset. I just want people to think about the Windrush scandal for 1 minute, because this generation, it's very dear to my heart because it's from where my parents came from the Caribbean. And they came to this country as people who were invited to come to the mother country from colonies, many colonies which were at the time fighting for independence, and of course they were invited to come here to help the mother country recover from the ravages of the Second World War. So, you're our people, you're part of us. Of course, the very people who just a couple of years ago was exposed that the then Home Secretary in 2014, the outgoing Prime Minister, Theresa May, was responsible for the hostile environment that meant to this day, as we sit in this room, people are being denied pensions, being denied social services, excluded from the country at a time when they should be enjoying the fruits of the decades that they have served in the workplace in this country. If people think that the hangover of colonialism doesn't exist, then the Windrush scandal should shake them out of that complacency.
Thanks. Also, being South African, I have found that the processes around decoloniality that are unfolding at the moment are so significant, because it's only now that Fanon is being celebrated to the extent, and as one of the comrades spoke about the EFF, Frantz Fanon's contribution is huge, not only in terms of the political revolution, but the internal individual psychic revolution of liberation from the brutality of what the racist colonization did to people's minds. And I think that Fanon's contributions around negritude and black consciousness, although he was critical of it, there's a debate about the extent of how critical he was, following on from Amy César, and then in South Africa being followed by Steve Biko. And I think that the tradition that's being celebrated now and being that's being celebrated around the liberation from that internalized oppression is so important. I think the fact that he was a revised Marxist is an additional point to the fact that he's speaking to people's internalized oppression as a result of coloniality.
My name is Frank, I'm from Berlin, and I just want to come to this relation of the anti-colonial struggle and the Communist Party that you're talking about in the workers' movement. The interesting thing about the anti-colonization movement in Algeria is that it actually stemmed from the workers' movement. In 1926, in France, a man called Messerly Hatch came from the Communist Party and founded the first independence party for Algeria. And at that time, the French Communist Party was very much in favor of anti-colonialism. So, for example, there was a fight in Morocco, in the Rif Mountains, and the party, which was at that time very tiny, supported it, despite the fact that the leadership of the movement in the Rif Mountains was very backward, so to speak. So, on a principled basis. But what did make it change? And the interesting thing is that the split between Messerly Hatch and the forerunner of the later FLN and the Communist Party was in 1936. The high point of the workers' struggle in France, when there was the line was a popular front, that means supporting the socialist-led government with the Republican Party at that time. And there was a physical split. Messerly Hatch and his people were on the Congress of the Communist Party, and they were physically kicked out because at the same time the French Communist Party would, turn towards, presenting the flag and all this stuff. And so that was the first point. So the Communist Party never said we are against independence. But then, they made all these twists and turns. So, for example, Maurice Thorez, who was at that time the leader of the party, he suddenly said, Algeria is not yet a nation. It is a nation en formation, so it will become a nation. Of course, later on we will support it, but at this moment, for technical reasons, we wouldn't support it. So, and it went on like this. Ken talked about, you just saw this terrible picture of Sétif, and it was really massacre. And the backstory of this is, the Vichy regime, the Hitler collaborating regime was in power till 1942, and came the Americans in the Second World War. The Americans actually tried to keep the fascist government in. They put the communists, the Gaullists, and the Muslim leaders all in prisons, but they didn't succeed. And out of this, more or less, a revolutionary situation developed in the years between 1943 and 1945. There was a mass movement led by Muslim revolutionaries. They called themselves Amis du Manifeste. And the communists in Algeria, in the towns, were attracted by this, because they weren't, the PNR weren't all settlers in the real sense. 90% were people living in the towns. And so, for example, the communists had a mayor in Bab el Oued, which is a part of Algiers. And they were attracted. But then, emissaries came from Paris of the Communist Party and pulling them out of this large movement. And what was the mobile behind it? The mobile was that the Communist Party decided on behalf of Stalin's thinking that they should support the goal and then join the government again. So when this massacre took place, they kept quiet because at the same time they had two ministers in a joint government in France. So I could go on like this, but the story is always the same. The Communist Party never said we are against independence. They never said we we are against for colonialism, but it made it always there. Trying to relate to the Socialist Party to keep it all together, have a progressive joint government, is time and again made them detach themselves from the people that Fanon was standing for.
So, yeah, would you like to come back?
Right. I think, as various contributions brought out, there's an awful lot more to say about Fanon and the politics of the period, which I hope people will read some of the other books, both for, as I said, for a general background. Leo Zellig's book is very good, but if you haven't read The Wretched of the Earth, for all my criticisms here and there of it, it's a magnificent book, and I would recommend to read it. And also Black Skin, White Masks, because Fanon started out psychologically trying to understand why it was that you had this kind of strange attitude sometimes by colonized people. And to come back to violence, one of the things that he was talking about was how it is that you get rid of that attitude. And I think there's an echo, if you like, of Marx's argument about the class struggle being a way that you use to get rid of the muck of ages and so on. That it's through the struggle that you become confident and smart enough and confident in yourself enough to reject the way that previous society was. Now, I think that there's a difficulty, and it's one that Fanon was aware of, because, as I said, he dealt with people who'd been through wars, that actually going through wars and the kind of horrific violence that people have been talking about can be psychologically destructive, and therefore it doesn't mean that at the end of it you feel liberated, but the idea that you've got to do something that will push aside the views that you had before is important. And I think but one of the things that's interesting, if you read even The Wretched of the Earth, there's bits where he's saying, look, I'm not saying that I want all white people shot. I'm not even saying that I want everyone, all the colonialists in Algeria, because he does point out to the fact that there were people who worked with the revolution and white people who were trying to help get independence. And I think some of the more interesting things he's talking about at the end are precisely things about what happens after independence. Who can you trust? Who is actually going to deliver? And I think that there's one of the things that's really interesting to look at is what happened. I mean, he was actually right to say that you couldn't trust a lot of the nationalist parties. One of the things that he hated, and I think various people have brought up, is the way that bits of the left sometimes talked. And they were, we're all for your freedom, we're all for your liberation, but when you're ready for it. And this idea that you're not ready yet, you hang on and we'll decide when. And certainly the attitude, the way that it was often put by the French Communist Party as an example, was something which seemed very similar, if you were an Algerian who was trying to get independence, to the position that was being put by the French government. This did lead to, there was all sorts of tensions inside the Communist Party. There were tensions inside the movement around the global, various movements around the global south, fighting for independence, about what that meant, what independence meant. And I think one of the things that's very difficult in a meeting like this is to look at the anti-colonial movement through the 20th century. And why I think this is important is because if you look at the experience of the period at the end of the First World War, when you had the Russian Revolution and the Bolsheviks were seen as internationally as the leaders, they put forward a particular view. This was the view of the early Communist International, which was, in order to get liberation for everyone, you have to support the liberation of the most oppressed, and that means you have to support independence for colonized countries. And that was the position that was taken by the early Communist International. As various speakers have said from the floor, it was a position that changed during the 1930s with the rise of the Popular Front, with the various ideas of national development replacing the idea of international socialism. And that was a tragedy tragedy, I think, for what happened later on, because it meant that in the great anti-colonial struggles after the Second World War, what people were looking to, even if they thought this is Marxism, we're Marxist revolutionaries, as I say, the ones in Algeria didn't on the whole, but in other countries they did, was a form of national development. How can we develop a national economy on the basis that the Russian economy has developed through developing industry, and this is a big change from what was being discussed in the period after the First World War, and I think that the fact that that had been pushed aside is one of the great tragedies, and I think that it's let me just see because it relates to a whole series of other things. Now, one of the other things that Fanon is often associated with is Pan-Africanism, the idea of having Africans coming together and organising initially against colonialism, and it's certainly something that in a way he was in favour of, but he was enormously contemptuous of a lot of the Pan-Africanists who were about at the time because he thought they were dreamers. One of the things that he was really angry about as a revolutionary, and if he was nothing else, he was a consistent revolutionary, was that you would have all sorts of people, whether it was the French Communist Party, whether it was various, often American activists and so on, who would say, we all need to come together, we need to unite, we'll have this wonderful thing in the future. And he would say, what the hell are you doing now? What are you doing now? And this led to sometimes, I think, slightly impractical ideas, like one of the things that he was trying to establish was a sort of African Legion. He wanted to set up a military unit based on the FLN or the ALN, which could go and help African revolutionary movements around the continent. Whether this would have been practical is something that can be argued at another time, but I think the important point was that he was sitting and thinking, what can we do that will make practical changes now? And I think that that is something which is a practical thing. There's a couple of other things which I haven't got time to talk about, but I think are worth looking into. One is the arguments about the role of women in the revolution and the role of the veil, which come up in his arguments about what happened in Algeria, and the push between the idea of the liberated Western woman who doesn't wear the veil and how women in Algeria were encouraged to stop wearing veiling themselves, and the confidence of women which women developed during the revolutionary struggles, where actually a lot of the women preferred to wear the veil for a number of reasons, one of which being that it was easier to carry arms under the voluminous clothes than it was when wearing Western clothes. But and if people have seen the Battle of Algiers will know this, there was also the thing that sometimes you got women to dress in the most Western clothes because then they were considered less suspicious. So there's all these kind of issues. There's issues about the role of Islam in the revolution, which, as I say, I really haven't got time to go in because it's quite a big topic, but how it was seen as part of the sort of progressive and democratic way of looking at things. Again, read more about it. I'm just going to just see other things that he may not have brought up. Just to come back, lots of people mentioned the issue of violence. I talked about this idea of violence being something which was, in a way, Fanon saw as cleansing. I would look at it differently. I think that the comment at the front was absolutely right. When we're talking about violence, we mustn't confuse the violence of the oppressed fighting back and the violence of the oppressor. This is one of the things that always happens, that you will have, and again you see it in the media here, day after day, the savage, brutal violence of oppressed people, and then you ignore the fact that Britain or America has just bombed them and killed hundreds and thousands or millions of people, and that you cannot make an equivalence between these sorts of violence. So when we're talking about revolution and violence, I think that you you can't say we want violence, but actually people have to defend themselves. If people are under attack, if you have tanks or whatever who are coming to attack the revolution, you have to be able to fight back. So that means at that level, I wouldn't condemn violence. You think that in the end, what will allow a revolution to succeed is not actually being able to match the old rulers or the American Air Force gun for gun, but it's actually finding other methods of power. But to think that we could get to that stage without any kind of violence is, I think, slightly wishful thinking. In terms of different types of using violence, it's worth mentioning that the French Secret Service, for instance, hijacked a plane which had the Algerian leader on it and flew it into French territory so they could capture him. So again, even the sorts of violence which are supposed to be, specialist terrorist violence, which isn't used by civilized states, they were quite prepared to use it when it suited their interests. And on the same subject, do remember the American Air Force, or Navy, I can't remember which one it was, shooting down an Iranian airliner. This is not something that used to happen when France did it and hasn't happened more recently. In the end, you need a theoretical understanding of what's going on in order to take things on. This is one of the things that Fanon was trying to do throughout his career. He was trying to understand things so he could change the world. And I think that that is one of the main reasons for remembering him and for reading what he's doing. That's why we're having this event. It's because we want to understand what's going on in order to change the world. That means looking at thinkers like Fanon and all the other people that we're looking at, but it means actively doing things to fight racism, fight Trump, fight whoever's the government is at the moment, all the time. And in order to do that, that's why the Socialist Workers' Party exists and why we ask people to join, because you say we're stronger together, stronger in understanding what to do and stronger in understanding how to fight back.